You heard it right there. Death penalty taken off the table, sentenced to life in prison. Let's get some perspective right now. I want to start right now with the lead news anchor from News 96.5 WDBO, Ray Caputo, who's been following this case and the saga of Markeith Loyd from the very beginning. Ray, great to have you. What's your reaction to this?
Well, you know what? I can't say that I'm completely surprised because Lenneman made a pretty good argument for his client in court and humanized him. You know, up until this trial, we didn't know a lot about Markeith Loyd other than the ramblings he had. So I guess I'm not surprised. Now, if justice was served is a different question. We know that the state wanted to put Markeith to death. They have another trial coming up. They can still do that. Sade Dixon's mom was not too happy. She believed in an eye for an eye. And she thought that Markeith Loyd deserved to die and not have a life just like her unborn grandson. So, you know, there's some parties that are happy, some parties not. Terry Lenneman's happy. I mean, this is why he was hired, to keep Markeith off death row. In fact, right after the verdict, he retweeted the news, and then they were all seen, you know, looking pretty gleefully in court. So, not surprised. I'll tell you, though, this is just a wind-up. The next trial with Deborah Clayton, Jesse, is going to get really interesting.
I'm going to get into that in a second. I just want to follow up with you, Ray, about one thing that I found interesting, and I didn't know if you got some perspective from Markeith Loyd's defense counsel about this, but during the closing argument yesterday, Mr. Lenneman mentioned that he felt the jury made the right decision by voting in favor of conviction, by saying you did the right thing by finding him guilty. And it's interesting because here on a legal perspective, so many times we see cases where the defense will say, we don't agree with what your decision was, however, we respect it. Here, he seemed to say he agreed that they made the right decision. Did you get any other insight from Markeith Loyd's camp about that and what the decision was as to that conviction?
Well, you know what, Jesse, there's so much evidence stacked against Markeith Loyd. I mean, for him to deny that he did this would have really blown up in his face. Looking at his face and trying to read his body language, he was a bit of an enigma. I gotta say that this is a guy who doesn't trust the process. He's checked out of it. If you look at him right now, I mean, just staring, he's not into it. I think that you know, perspective is that Markeith, he probably just doesn't care. I mean,
he didn't even want to be there during the verdict. He said yesterday in open court, I waive my right to appear and be with the jury when they come back with their decision, and he even wanted to waive his right to ultimate sentencing. Now, obviously, he didn't do that. He did appear. Jessica, I want to turn to you real quick. Ray mentioned the upcoming trial. So we have the trial of the death of Lieutenant Deborah Clayton. This is scheduled for February 4th, 2020. Will the state put the death penalty on the table in that case after not getting it here, and maybe they have a better chance in that kind of case? What do you think?
I think that they will, because it's law enforcement, and when it comes to law enforcement, we have to protect law enforcement, and it would look really bad if they didn't. So I do think that they will put the death penalty on again, and they might get it because this time it was law enforcement, and not that the victims here were not any less sympathetic, but this is law enforcement. And as a country as a whole, we do protect our law enforcement. And even though as a country we're kind of stepping back from the death penalty, not so much when it comes to law enforcement.
Joseph, I want to turn to you. Joseph Scott Morgan from Jacksonville State University is with me. I want to ask you this question. Big part of the defense's case, and we're going to get into it during the sentencing phase, was the mental health aspect. That there was such a mental health, you know, they called that a psychiatrist, a neuropsychologist, a psychologist, talking about the different issues that were going on with Markeith Loyd, PTSD, psychotic thought disorder, trying to characterize it. What was your perspective on that? Because as we look back at this shooting, I got to tell you, I didn't, for me personally, I believed what they were saying. I said, well, that probably makes sense if this is a guy who constantly thought his life was in danger. It might have been a delusional aspect of it. It might have a psychotic aspect of it, but it helped explain this shooting a little bit further if you believe those experts. What's your take on that?
Well, you know, yeah, you would think that some of that's going to mitigate perhaps the actions that he took. Of course, we'll see how that plays into the upcoming trial relative to the deceased lieutenant. But yeah, and you know, you compare and contrast that with this wild ramblings in that pretrial that has been broadcast worldwide over and over again. I don't really know. It's an interesting point. I got to tell you, though, one of the most compelling witnesses for me throughout this entire event was this brother, Ronald.
Oh, yeah.
He was the calm in the midst of the storm. This young man went through so much, and he gave us very, very precise detail about what happened to him being gunned down there in the presence of his sister and this unborn child. People talk about bravery all the time and how brave someone is. This young man, he just remained completely in control of his faculties. A perfect witness. I think that the trial turned on his testimony.
First of all, it's a miracle that he's alive, considering how many times he was shot, and it was a miracle that he was able to testify. So I agree with you. He was one of the strongest witnesses we saw. We're going to take a break. When we come back, we're going to play you some of the things you might have missed. We're going to start with the prosecution's closing argument in this penalty phase from yesterday. Stay tuned.